Hey, Clyde, welcome to the Monitoring the Situation episode of BDE. Happy to have special guest Dave Pursell back for another rousing macro conversation. We keep going after, despots and dictators, on the cadence of once a month. We're gonna have to make you a regular co-host. But happy that we got Kirk today too. So. Wanted to start off with, I think there's a lot of anticipation over the weekend, at least in the energy financial world, EFT, and talking about expected response. And, as I look at it now, crude's still hanging in there above 70. But initial reaction, pretty akin to what we saw last summer with Operation Midnight Hammer. So this certainly appears to be, of course, with our much more frontline direct involvement, appears to be, at least initially, maybe shaking off some of what some of the pundits over the weekend would otherwise. But let's start with kind of a macro and Iran oil and gas level set.
Yeah, so I think the question you always want to ask is, there's always risk premium, there's short covering, there's the things that get price going up. But is there a supply disruption? Is there the potential for a supply disruption, and is that going up? The difference between today and Operation Midnight Hammer is there's a lot of stuff going on in the Persian Gulf in and around it, right? Midnight Hammer was very targeted, very select, hit a couple things and you're gone. This is much different, with the U.S. hitting multiple sites in Iran and Iran firing back at U.S. sites allegedly in neighboring countries. So all this is going on around the Persian Gulf. You get a lot of reports that are hard to verify. Did Iran sink or shoot at an oil tanker? But we know there's fighting going on in the Persian Gulf and around the Persian Gulf. And that's where you should be concerned around supply disruptions. And you've seen it. Maersk and others have said, we're not shipping in the region, so we're just going to take the long way around, whether that's oil products, or tennis shoes. They're staying out of the region. So those are the things that LNG is allegedly being impacted as well. So I think you just want to look this week and say, what's that intensity around the shipping lanes? And does Iran get emboldened and try to, kind of as the last ditch, do they try to hit Saudi oil infrastructure? Those are the two things that make me kind of lose sleep on this.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been watching is, I saw a little bit of the Secretary of War and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs were talking about, the media is interested in what the predicate is. They're, hearing Democrats say, well, we kind of did an end around on authorization. Well, under the War Powers Act, the president has pretty broad discretion, but looking at what the stated or the implied predicate is that we had Midnight Hammer, and we've been using terms like obliterated their nuclear capability. But what I saw a little bit ago was, well, they've created this kind of conventional, very heavy on ballistic missile capability and drones, et cetera, and have not allowed the inspectors and auditors to come back in. There's been a standoff on weaponization, et cetera. And so we've seen I guess a wider field of fire in these first retaliatory strikes from Iran all the way to Bahrain. Qatar's pulled its LNG, shut it down. And you mentioned the Strait traffic kind of workaround. Ras Tanura, I think, got hit in a minor way with some debris from an intercepted attempted drone strike. And so these things appear to be fairly limited and easy to, relatively easy, or at least the way the market's absorbing it and pricing in risk here, which has been a fairly mild reaction, just given when you start to think about the scope of things. But the notion that, we're reserving the right for this to be weeks, not days. Is there something we don't see? What could happen?
Well, the weeks, not days is probably part of the reason why crude's up. I think you're given opportunity for regime change from within. If you just say we're going to do this for 4 or 5 days, they can do the Muhammad Ali rope-a-dope, right? They can go hunker down for 4 or 5 days and maybe make it through the other side, where if this thing's going to be just an absolute pounding for weeks, what's left at the end of that? And so I think it gives the regime pause, but it also gives folks in country time to kind of start to continue the groundswell and see if there can be regime change. I think ultimately that would be I think you did Midnight Hammer to hit the nuclear capability, and I think you did this for regime change. And I can be proven wrong on that, but I think that's why you do this one, and that's why you hit the targets you hit, and hopefully there's something with organization that can fill that void.
I mean, if you're a government major or an oil trader, besides those two people, who cares about this is my question. And I don't mean that facetiously. I'm asking, does anyone really care? Does this really impact global markets on any level? I mean, it reminds me a little bit of Ukraine, where it's just a war. I mean, there's people putting flags up because they care. But other than that, it doesn't impact me on a day-to-day basis. Who does this impact and why?
It's a great question. I think Ukraine, if you say, okay, what's the impact outside of Ukraine? It was clearly steel prices. So there was a steel component. If you were in Europe, natural gas prices.
And if you owned a Porsche, Ukraine made the only components for most Porsches. So that was an issue.
Yeah. So the 0.1% of the population was really hurt. But I think with steel here, it's a little bit broader because it is oil. And I think it's, more shipping, just it's inflationary. I do think there's this is way beyond my scope, but is this, this hurts the Chinese. I mean, you go in, China spends a lot of money in Venezuela, and that looks like a pretty bad investment right now. They've spent a lot of time kind of backing the Iranian regime, and that feels like a pretty bad investment right now. So, is there a more subtle, hey, let's hurt China in the pocketbook as a potential Taiwan deterrent? And again, there's that's saying 2 + 2 = 22, but I think there is something there.
Yeah, I saw Dave, one of our friends and former colleagues, sent something. I was glad to see this. Rapidan CEO was out talking about what the Iranians have the capacity to do or what they don't have the capacity to do. And they clearly, in a conventional sense, don't have, at least the viewpoint from Rapidan, who speaks Farsi, by the way, and was ex-CIA. They don't have the military capacity to fight and win. And so the belief is their strategy may be to continue to try and hit oil infrastructure, which, if you believe, some of those things targeted at Gulf states is about, then you get more of a intermediate term kind of shift upward in prices, which ultimately hurts the U.S. And then that's long enough, particularly in the middle of a pretty crucial political season defined as the 2026 midterms, the U.S. come to the table.
Well, you remind that reminds me of a famous movie quote. Some people just want to watch the world burn, or something to that effect. We saw that in Iraq as they were retreating, they set their wells on fire. So why would they do that? Well, it's the last ditch effort, and so that's where, again, to me, the two things are: you look at Gulf shipping and you look at Saudi infrastructure. That 1 square mile of processing facility that takes guar and abcake production is a pretty important target. Again, it goes back to the Iran-Iraq war, where they were shooting, but I think both sides were shooting at oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. And if you remember, the U.S. put naval officers on the bridge of those tankers, so they were basically American flag tankers coming in and out of the Persian Gulf to protect them. So there is precedent to this, and I'm not predicting it happens, but I think those are the signs I'm watching over the next couple of weeks to see if they start doing that, it clearly says they're desperate, but that's where the risk, a real supply side risk, goes up.
I mean, Dave, there's over 200 million barrels of Iranian oil floating on tankers right now. So what is happening? I mean, it seems like they've been trying to push as much oil onto tankers as possible. At the same time, I think much of Iranian power, like Tehran, is powered by their own oil, but they need to keep gas flowing in order to do that. What's happening? I mean, it's interesting to watch. At the same time, you got China that has I think I looked this up. I was trying to figure out, but they have 111 million barrels of strategic reserves sitting there as well. So I'm trying to figure out if someone saw this coming, and what is happening. Is it really weeks, or does anyone really care? There's a lot of questions in that, I know.
Yeah. So one, the oil on the water is important. I think the Chinese strategic reserve, they're probably some of the best oil traders in the world historically. Whether they were stocking up for potential Taiwan invasion, or they saw this coming, they're usually looking far over the horizon. So I think hard to know, but clearly they're preparing for something. The U.S. has, what are we at, 400? Just for perspective, we're at 400 and some odd million in our strategic reserves. So there's plenty of oil available if there's a disruption, but you start to eat into that insurance policy, right? And that's the question. How long does that insurance policy last? And once that insurance policy's diminished, then you've got no buffer. So I don't think oil goes. I'm not saying oil is going to go to 100, 120, but a supply disruption would certainly kick in the circuit breakers on. The IEA would do the coordinated release. Again, in Europe, those are refined products. In the U.S., that's crude. So you'd have this IEA-led release of strategic stocks. China would certainly start to dip into theirs and buy as much of the Iranian crude as possible. So, those are first steps. But again, that's a short-lived thing. We should have 727 million barrels in our strategic reserves if our politicians didn't use it as a piggy bank. But that's a whole different political conversation. So we have plenty, but we should have more.
How much do you think of, it's hard to tell about the next tranche of OPEC cut restoration? That was I think 137,000 barrels a day number that was somewhat floating around over the weekend. And then I think yesterday I saw something where there was some talk of them maybe increasing that to 206,000 barrels a day. What should we be thinking about with respect to OPEC here and what they do or don't do?
Yeah, I think you'll see them increase production. And I would assume they lean into the high end of whatever they were thinking. I think the real question is who's actually got excess capacity to put on the water. I think you've got Saudi and a few others, but so if they say 250,000 barrels a day, how much actually hits the water? That's a important conversation, and we won't know until you start to look at the tanker traffic. So there's just there's always uncertainty around OPEC production. It makes it a lot more opaque today, but I think they're going to try to make sure that the world is amply supplied. I mean, the way I think about Saudi Arabia, it is important for them to be able in times like this to put more oil on the market to keep prices from spiking. Because if they can't show that they have significant excess capacity, they're just another big oil producer. There's no strategic advantage, right? Their strategic advantage is they can walk in and say, we got this. Here's another 500,000 barrels a day. Oil markets, we're good, right? That's why they have friends in the world. And, it goes back to there was a petroleum data quality conference in Madrid, Spain, when Secretary Richardson was head of the DOE. I think I've used this analogy before, but it's important. We were all talking about, hey, we need better data out of Saudi and out of OPEC. We need production, we need reserves, we need all this. And this guy stood up and he had this nice Armani suit, and his business card was advisor to oil minister Al-Naimi, which is like a pretty cool business card to have. And he got up and he basically said very politely, you guys are wasting oxygen. We're not, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is not going to give you that information. We're not going to tell you what our spare capacity is. And he said, wait a minute, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will provide you with all of that information, including spare capacity, if the U.S. government provides us with the location of your missile silos in Kansas.
Of course. We said yes, right?
Well, because everybody in the room laughed. And I was thinking that actually is one of the most profound things I've heard in a long time, because that excess capacity is their strategic advantage. They're not going to tell you how much they have. They're going to tell you, but they're not going to show you. And so as long as it's believed they've got, to quote Spike Dykes, they're the big stinging lizard in the oil markets, that they can deliver on this excess capacity, then yeah, they've got a massive geopolitical, they're of significant geopolitical importance. And so I think Saudi will do what they can to make sure the market's well supplied.
Dave, here's my question, because I'm trying to unpack this for us, that OPEC announced this increase on the same Sunday that the Strait of Hormuz became a live fire zone. And the Strait of Hormuz controls how much of the world's oil, and it's a parking lot.
Yeah, no, it's a lot. And so I think what they're banking on is that the U.S. Navy is going to keep that open, right? We'll do our part. We'll produce oil. We'll put it on ships. Somebody else has to make sure that the strait's open. And look, for full disclosure, I mean, I'm a victim of public school education, right? I didn't know where the
same here
Persian Gulf was. So I always pull my maps out and look, and it's just it continues to be important to show how close everything is and how narrow the Straits of Hormuz are, and there it is a choke point. And so just looking at all the flows and there's a lot of important oil production and infrastructure in a very, very small radius there.
How many oil traders are texting Pete Hegseth right now trying to figure out what his next move is?
Well, if I were to be, well, I won't. They're probably texting Don Jr., but that's another.
Of course, yeah, no, it's not direct, if not at all.
Yeah, you know that's going on, but I'm not sure that would be all that helpful actually to know at this point. I think crude's up. Now it's just a function of what do the Iranians do, not what the US does.
Well, who are the Iranians at this point?
Well, that's the question. I don't know. That's where you hope you get regime change. You get somebody in the military steps in and says, "Okay, enough," because it's got to be somebody in the military.
But if you thought through this, and we'll go to you, Mark, in a second. I've thought through this for ever since I got to college. Is great regime change. CIA comes in. They have this like playbook. They dust off this big manual about how to create a government. But the fact is that's really difficult. I mean, it's so hard when you think of just the U.S. transition teams, the thousands of people that go into switching from one government to a next, and it's all coordinated. What happens when there is no truly coordinated and this regime change happened? What do you do? I mean, that's months, years. I mean, right now, if you think about just from an energy perspective, power generation in Iran is 80 to 90% gas fired. They have to produce condensate to keep the lights on. Who's doing that? Forget the whole government. Like, who's going to give you like a passport because I want to fly to Canada for my cousin's wedding? I mean, what's going on?
Well, there's a lot there, and I know Mark's got a lot to say on this too. But I think again, way over my skis. The challenge with regime change in a historically Muslim country is where's the infrastructure? Where's the social infrastructure? Where's the power infrastructure? It's all religious, right? And so who are the important people? Who do people look up to? Well, it's going to be a religious leader most likely. Well, so do you trade one for another, and have you actually improved the lot? Maybe not. It's. I think that's the risk of regime change. It like you said, it's easy on paper. It's much more difficult in practice. So, Mark, what do you think?
I think when you think of the context of Iran in particular, you look at the last 47 years since the revolution. There is a theocratic dictatorship, which at the very top is led by the supreme leader, who is now dead. And I think there's some rumor floating around that they got the interim who was appointed shortly after. And, we've seen this kind of knockoff succession. I don't know who's providing the intel, but it's pretty amazing to see. But like in Venezuela, what we did was, I think, in the extreme, hope for some type of opposition regime change. Well, we didn't get that. And what you saw was an ability or a willingness on the part of the administration to work with really who was next in line behind Maduro. Well, you have a tremendous amount of negotiating leverage at that point because you went in and got Maduro. Is the same thing going to happen here? Because, you look at recent events in Iran, the protests are heavily, and not only in Iran, but worldwide, protests are, we want to completely undo what the last 47 years have been about. Meaning, I think in some scenario, it would be a return to the days of the Shah, right? One of the most progressive Eastern countries in the world, in Iran. And whether that kind of big step change is something that is practically doable given our approach here, the president has already conveyed a willingness to at some point speak with the new leadership. The question is, the new leadership kind of Khamenei light or IRGC light, or knowing that, a lot of their leverage has now been obliterated, that we're going to get some kind of consideration back. And if you look at what the primary discussion was after Venezuela, the summit at the White House about going in and helping the Venezuelans rebuild their oil infrastructure and their capacity. Most of what Iran exports is subject to sanction. Are we willing to work with something that is a relic of the old regime and administration, or are we going to wait for kind of chaos to fill the vacuum? Because I don't know what the true opposition capacity for taking control of the country is. And one thing, just as a qualifier, one thing that Dan Pickering used as a qualifier this morning, said, "Look, I'm just a geopolitical tourist here, and I hold my hand up. I'm a geopolitical tourist." But is that getting to the Iran is number 3 in the world in terms of crude reserves. They're one of the largest producers in the world. Most of what their export capacity does today is through shadow and workarounds get to China, right? So is there a parallel play for us to create more access to what Iran can do from its oil industry side and work something out with whatever the next regime looks like, whether it's a facsimile of what just got destroyed at the top layer or something completely different?
Yeah, so I think if you think about this president, he is not a friend of the oil and gas business. He's a friend of low oil and gas prices. So what is he going to wait around for a democracy to break out? No, I think he's going to wait for a new regime that's not going to build nuclear weapons. And if he can get that, that's a win for him. It's probably a win for the world. And then he'll negotiate and take sanctions off, and it's negative for oil price. Right, oil prices are going to go up, and then you'll have a path for investment into the country. Again, it's like Venezuela; it's going to take a while, but you have a path for more money to go in the country and help the infrastructure, and it's money and investment that's not Chinese. So I think that all makes sense. I think back to Kirk's point with how do you keep the lights on in country. It depends on what the regime looks like. If you look at Egypt back when the Muslim Brotherhood took over, there wasn't there was no impact to production of oil and natural gas because the infrastructure is out in the Western Desert, so it was away from it was farther away from harm's way. But even the Muslim Brotherhood knew where their bread was buttered and that they needed that oil and gas production. They needed that revenue to keep the country going. And I think in a rational world, the new regime is going to do what they can to let the oil guys do their, keep stuff flowing. Unless you get that, I just want to watch the world burn mentality, then all bets are off. So again, there's a lot there. I think it made sense, but I am a tourist as well, Mark.
I mean, this is like, not to bring up the past, but I'm going to. I mean, everyone wants the mullahs gone. Nobody agrees on what comes next. The Sunnis want a seat at the table. I mean, imagine that. You could imagine when the bourbon comes out after all the cameras are off in Medina, that the Saudis are like, man, we need a seat at the table in Iran. That conversation happens all the time as the hashish is burning. I mean, Pahlavi wants his dad's table back, and the IRGC wants to make sure no one flips the table over. I mean, this is probably the most dangerous succession crisis, maybe. Well, definitely this year, for sure.
Oh, no.
I was
No
going to say in
question.
our lifetime, but I don't think we realize like how it's like you'd rather it's the devil, you know. And I know we have the whole nuclear idea happening, but this is a powder keg. It'll be interesting to see what really happens because there's so much. I mean, Iran, whether we like to say it or not, as you said, Dave, about maybe it's better for the world, but Iran has always sort of been the other Muslim country that has sort of kept the rest of the Sunni world at bay and to some degree.
Yeah.
But now you have that totally in play, and there's what Sunnis are only like 5% of the country, but the rest of the Muslim world are feel very differently. So if you don't install a religious leader now, which is people are pushing for this sort of religious free democratic government, that's a foothold into creating an Iran that maybe goes along with the rest of the Sunni world, which wants their view of the world is very different than the United States. I'll tell you that. I'm just wondering what, and we're talking about it from an energy perspective, but if you really think what's in play here, energy is just kind of what brings everyone to the table.
Yeah, that's the impact. That's why the rest of the world cares. So yeah, I don't know how to answer that again. I'm a victim of public school education, and back during the Iraq War, there was a good book called The Shia Revival. It was put out by a guy who taught at the Naval War College, and it's a really good history. And it for me, it was a good kind of right down the middle backdrop of kind of how you think about that conflict. It's kind of like Catholic, Protestant, Northern Ireland, but on a much larger scale.
If I was up in Northern Scotland this last summer, and man, that war is still on fire. And when they ask me questions about which football, and I'm not talking about American football team I followed, I knew that the answer would either create goodwill or they'd be throwing me out of their taxi. So, yeah, good point, Dave.
Yeah. Yeah.
The hatred is still burning on every part of the world when it comes to an enemy. That's for sure.
Well, we saw what an attempted Shia incursion in a majority Sunni country in Pakistan yesterday in Karachi. They got in the first perimeter of security around the consulate, which is a building, by the way, from which I watched the Super Bowl one year, and it was one of the Super Bowls in which the Cowboys defeated the Buffalo Bills. So that gives you an idea how long ago it was. But yeah, those are real interesting kind of cultural and balance of power shift throughout really the world of Islam and Islamic republics. But I back to the parallels with Venezuela regime change or partial pseudo regime change, if you can think about Venezuela that way. Ultimately, I think we'd be naive to think, because we've said for the longest time that Trump is not per se an oil and gas industry ally, certainly not the U.S. oil and gas industry. Trump is a low oil price guy. And so the notion that you've got, one of the world's largest producers, third largest proved reserves in the world, OECD inventories are now back above the 5-year average, first time since 2021. You've got this time around, and we'll put up the Phil Verliger analysis or table of all these precipitating events over many, many years and what the 30, 60, 90-day reaction was to crude prices. Most of those where you had sustained price action either way, you didn't have, you didn't have the supply diversification. You certainly didn't have another kind of fresh new 10 million barrels a day out of the U.S. that you've got now that you didn't have 15 years ago. And so all of these things, I think, are structurally bearish today, and the reason that you see somewhat of a contained reaction when the perception is this could expand in scope pretty quickly, and it's a lot bigger in implied scope in force concentration than we saw back in Midnight Hammer.
Yeah, 15 years ago, if this had happened, prices would have been up more than $4 or $5 a barrel. No question, in my opinion. I think the market gets numb to risk premium, and it's a show me market. I think you have to have a meaningful supply disruption to continue to see crude move higher.
So again, the Venezuela-Iran parallel, and we talked a lot about the state of PDVSA and how it's declined over the last 25 years. And you're inheriting a big kind of rehabilitation program, not only from a capital and execution perspective, but also from your state oil company partner in terms of capability. Any perspective on comparing and contrasting the Iranian national company with something like PDVSA? It seems, just outside looking in, they've done a pretty good job of maintaining the asset that is, Iran's oil and gas infrastructure.
Yeah, it feels like it. It's hard to get visibility, but I think they are better today than PDVSA is. They've probably got
by a lot.
I would think so, by a lot. Now they've got better assets. You're not dealing with really mature. Sorry to my Venezuelan friends, but you're not dealing with mature conventional oil in Lake Maracaibo and a bunch of really heavy oil in Orinoco. I mean, you got much better reservoir rock and crude quality to work with. You've got one of the biggest gas fields in the world, if not the biggest gas field in the world, for your LNG and condensate. So they got better assets, and it's always hard to mess up a really good asset. But they also have Chinese capability and capital behind them. So, which isn't great, but it's okay. I mean, it seems to have been worked for a while. I would imagine real technology and capital could come in and really help out. But I've got much better visibility on Venezuela than I do on Iran.
So this is not investment advice, but what we've seen in the past series of these types of events is that kind of fading the trade has been the right call. I did see someone poking fun at Jim Cramer's call this morning to sell half your oil stocks.
Well, yeah, wrong way Jimmy, as I think some people call him, makes me pause on that one. Yeah, I don't know, Kirk. What do you think?
No, if you look at this, and maybe it's just as we get older, I think this is a yawn. It's a hiccup. In terms of, if you look at what's happened with the oil prices, and we are truly living in a global market where there's a lot of, who's the swing provider anymore? I mean, the Saudis haven't even touched their unconventionals. They've got so much oil. They to me, every time I talk to someone over at Aramco, the one message that keeps coming back, that's sort of like, we have so much we haven't even tried to get yet. Ha ha ha. But the world has a lot of oil that hasn't been touched. And so I think in some ways, and you've got this big US domestic capability that was unleashed in some way. I know we can't export it. That's a whole different story. But this to me is a yawn moment on oil and gas prices, but that should scare all of us, because what's not being talked about is the regime change and what really is going to happen, because the powder keg is the Middle East and always has been. Maybe that's because that's where Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, and that created the whole mess in the first place, if you believe that. But I think that's the story we're going to be talking about in a year from now. It's kind of like when Putin went over and during the Olympics and captured that little territory that he thought was his. Kind of people are like, man, what happened? Same with Ukraine. Like, this is one of those growing, sort of festering little itches, skin disease problem that if you don't take care of it quickly, it's going to kill you. I think that's going to be the story. And if Iran blows up and becomes the geopolitical event that it could, that's going to be the more interesting analysis, because right now we're all like yawning and let's move on, and we're watching the women taking their hijabs off and celebrating in the streets and telling their, the religious police to go screw yourself because we're not going to listen to you anymore. That's all really cool to watch and really fun. But the question is who's behind the scenes and what are they trying to do and why is that? What's the real objective? That to me is what we should be watching, and stay tuned is all I'm going to say.
In that chaotic scenario where there's a lot of uncertainty, we've seen these types of things precipitate or raise global recessionary pressures, which has a direct impact on global demand. And I guess we can finish it up here, maybe touching on demand.
Yeah, well, I look at how much oil OPEC's put on the market allegedly in the last 12 months or so, and inventories are, if you believe the OECD, which I historically do, you're just above 5-year averages. You look at Cushing inventories, you're still kind of rocking along the bottom. I think that tells you two things. Either some of the OPEC members can't hit their objectives, and that's a possibility, or demand is really good. And if you look at the implied demand numbers in the US, so these are the product supplied numbers. So it's an implied demand number. They're not great, but they're okay. Your 3.4% growth year to date, year over year, your 5.4% year over year over the last 4 weeks. Now you've got probably bad weather comps a year ago. I mean, there's a lot, the noise there, but those are the 3.4% growth in the US for the first 2 months of the year versus year ago. I don't care if that gets revised down to 2.4%. That is salty growth, man, for a fifth of the world demand. So I think you got both of those playing. You've got decent demand, and you've got maybe a little bit less supply hitting the market than the models would tell you. And as long as oil prices stay lower, there's a decent catalyst for that demand to continue. The worst thing that could happen is a price spike, and then you start to significantly moderate demand.
I mean, Dave, I know you're a loyal listener, so you know that we've solved some of the demand spikes are temporary in the US because we're going to all EV cars, as you know, because no one's buying ICE cars anymore. And we're putting data centers in space. So there goes AI need for demand. So where is that demand going?
Yeah. I know. I don't know. Somewhere. Yeah.
Private jets.
Well, it's to get the rockets into space to get the AI.
That's true. That's true.
It's temporary jet fuel demand, rocket fuel demand.
Speaking of rockets, we were cynically commenting about the IEA, and we're going to hear something from them this week in terms of a report. But I think I made the comment that they'll probably issue the report on missile emissions and climate change as a result of military action that's taken place over the weekend before, we get something thoughtful out of the IEA, at least in terms of the leadership. But
they've morphed into a wildly disappointing organization. I think their data, the data folks are good. The ones who who generate the oil market report, looking at the current data. I think they do a great job, but the organization itself has just become a massive finger in the wind. What do people want us to think? And that's not why that organization was built. That's not why that organization was put together and funded. It was to help us understand critical issues in the oil and gas, global oil and gas business. And they get a huge F for that over the last decade. It's just a complete embarrassment.
So IEA, step up. This is your moment. And Kirk, notice I snuck that in because I snuck the IEA in, which is a verboten topic when Chuck's on.
I mean, I didn't realize that BDE is becoming an IEA watchdog podcast, but it might as well be.
It's one of the many useful functions that BDE plays.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm actually admiring like the scenario teams, both at, well, I don't know about BP's team at this point, but at Shell. And when they do these big outlooks, those guys are fantastic. And when I was at Shell, I got to meet some of the guys that wrote some of our scenario analysis. But I don't know why the IEA doesn't protect and allow the true data analysts to do their jobs. It's unfortunate.
Yeah. Couldn't said it better.
Well, Dave, what a pleasure having you, and thank you for bringing up the public education. I went to a proper university, the University of Texas, so at least we have that going for us.
Well, I got to show A&M here, so I'm repping the colors here. But yeah, I think I think world geography is important here, particularly in this little event we have going on.
Well, two questions before we leave you. One is, if you're in the Strait of Hormuz and you're a kid, are you like getting your little boat and becoming a terrorist on the waters? And what could you charge to do that? Secondly, what percentage of oil and gas executives are Aggies?
So one, no, I'm not getting in my boat. And two, the second answer is not nearly enough.
At one point, I thought there were more Aggies running oil and gas than by far than any other university. That's got to still be true.
I don't know. It may be. I hope so.
Well, that's an answer for next time then.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everybody. If you like this show, share it with your friends, and we'll see you next.
And like, subscribe, and if you have an answer of what's happening in Iran, please tell us and make your prediction.
I've got the Nate Bargatze from the Washington's Dream skit when he's asked to pronounce Fahrenheit or explain something nobody knows.
I just remember being in school, public school, of course, in Houston. And this kid on Fridays always wore the same t-shirt. I ran from Iran in 1978. Cheers.